Hi, my name is Kilby Helms, and I did my research paper on Amy Carmichael. I actually grew up really loving Amy Carmichael. I first felt called to missions through reading of her life and her ministry in India, but this semester I realized that I didn't know so much about her ministry and her missions before her time in India. So I really focused on that with three main points. First, looking at her ministry in Ireland, where she was originally from. Secondly, looking at her missions in Japan and Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka. And finishing with spending some time looking at her ministry in India, as well as the ministry that she had through her books and through her writings that we can still glean from today. Amy was the oldest of 7 children, and when she was 18, her dad actually died unexpectedly, which left Amy in a position of kind of being second mother to her youngest siblings. And Amy took this as an opportunity to really have this be her ministry. She shared the gospel with them. She taught them the love of Christ. And through this, she really came to love ministering to others. Amy began attending Keswick Bible meetings not long after this time of sharing the gospel with her siblings, and it was through this that she kind of had a second awakening and a realization that she was called to ministry outside of just her family, that she was called to minister to the people in her community. This really began with Amy starting to notice these girls in her town of Belfast who were called Shawlies. And they were called this because they were extremely impoverished. They worked in the factories and they didn't have the money to buy bonnets, and so they wore shawls around their heads. And even people in Amy's church would look down on them, on these girls. And so it really broke Amy's heart and gave her this burden and this longing to share with them. And so these Shawlies really became Amy's first mission field, her first ministry. She began Bible studies with them and night schools so they could become educated. And eventually, she actually outgrew the building that she was using for this. And so this was when Amy began her very first mission endeavor officially, her first ministry endeavor, where she sought the funds, she sought the money, and she built her own ministry building called the Welcome Hall. It was so successful that a few years later, another one was built in England, where Amy moved to be able to focus her time there. This was really all in preparation for the foreign missions that would take place. And in January of 1892, at a Keswick Bible meeting, Amy finally felt called by the Lord to go and serve overseas. And through this, she became Keswick's very first missionary to go overseas. Amy really struggled during this time because she, ongoing throughout her life, struggled with loneliness, and especially during this time when a lot of her friends and even members alongside her with this Keswick ministry really kind of shamed her for abandoning her role and her responsibilities in Ireland and in England to go overseas. But the Lord really comforted her during this time, even though Amy didn't really know where to go. She knew she was supposed to go overseas, but she didn't know where. And then she heard Hudson Taylor at a Keswick Bible meeting talking about his China Inland mission. During this time, she thought that this would be a good opportunity for her to go. She began preparation for China, and she was really close to going. She had packed everything. She had said her goodbye. She had raised the money. And the night before she was supposed to go, the doctor from the China Inland Mission said, "You're not fit physically, you're not able to go." And so Amy really was devastated. She had no other plans. She had, again, said all of her goodbyes. She was ready to go and to answer the calling of the Lord. And so she returned home a bit discouraged, still content with where the Lord had her, but knowing that she was meant to go. And so only a few years later, the Lord suddenly called Amy to Japan. Amy didn't know anyone in Japan, but this man, Mr. Wilson, who had become a father figure to her, he did know someone there. And so he wrote a letter seeing if there would be an open spot for Amy. And Amy was so confident in this being the will of the Lord that before the letter of response even came back to her, she had already booked passage to Japan and had packed and prepared for the journey. And in Amy's first year in Japan, she actually suffered quite a lot. Early on arriving there, she saw the turmoil within the missionaries, which was quite discouraging to her because she was lonely. She did suffer from that, and so she was really hoping to find encouragement in the missionaries there. She also suffered illnesses continuing during that time, and after only being in Japan for a year, had to go to a resting home for the missionaries in China because her health was so poor. And she didn't know that would be the last time that she was ever in Japan. While in China at this resting home, she discovered that her illness had become so bad due to the climate in Japan. And after only resting a week in this home, she had found another missions opportunity in Sri Lanka. And so even though people were warning her against it, saying she wasn't prepared, Amy always consulted and trusted fervently the will of the Lord above the suggestions or the warnings of men. And so she was on her way to Sri Lanka, where she served in a village there among children and women. But once again, after not even a year in Sri Lanka, she was informed that Mr. Wilson, this man who had been a father to her, was very ill. So she returned to England unexpectedly and actually spent 10 months there. This is where she first wrote her very first book. And she would go on to actually write 40 more books throughout her lifetime. But once again, she was not content with where she was. She knew that she needed to go. She knew that she needed to serve the nations with bringing the gospel to them, serve the Lord through bringing the gospel to the unreached. Amy was invited by a friend to go and work in Bangalore, India. And once Amy arrived in India in 1895, she never returned back to England or to Ireland, and she remained in India. It was a bit hard for Amy when she first arrived because of colonialism that was taking place at that time that kind of had Westerners in this stigma, but her love for others and her zeal for the Lord quickly put her outside of that stereotype categorization of missionaries. Amy first began mission work in a hospital as an evangelist and spent time sharing with people there, but also learning language, which was an ongoing theme of struggle for Amy through her journal entries in all of the countries that she served in. Amy had a difficult first year in India, especially with the other missionaries. They're kind of colliding because they wanted to live this separate life from the Indians, and Amy wanted to live among them. And thankfully, the Lord answered her prayers. And after only 1 year of being there, she met a family who lived in southern India who did live this type of life. And so she went and lived with them and spent a few years in a few different villages. But eventually, she moved to a place called Dohnavur, where she would end up spending the rest of her life. When she first arrived there, had struggles with the caste system because it really was the biggest issue when it came to sharing the gospel. If people were of high caste, then they didn't want to hear what you had to say. And another great issue that Amy saw was that of the sex trafficking that was happening, the temple prostitution. And this was a huge shock to Amy, and it burdened her greatly. And after not even being there for so long, in 1901, Amy became a kidnapper. She met this 7-year-old girl named Prina and was very burdened for her because Prina was a temple prostitute at the age of 7. And so she kidnapped Prina, and what first became just Amy's love for the lost, love for this hurting girl, soon became her Dohnavur fellowship. It started with just this one girl, and within a few years there were nurseries that were built. There were schools and churches. Amy began rescuing girls and boys, babies, toddlers from these temples. And this is what she became known for. This was what is now known as Dohnavur Fellowship. Started with Amy rescuing these girls and these boys. Amy continued to suffer with ill health, and after several years of working at Dohnavur, she fell and broke her leg and was never able really to recover. And so she spent the rest of her life ministering from her bed. This was when she wrote most of her writings, many of her books. And eventually, only a few years later, she died. She passed away. But Dohnavur Fellowship is still thriving today. It still is rescuing girls and boys. It has spread out to having hospitals, having bigger schools, and the legacy of Amy Carmichael can still be seen through that, can still be seen through her writings, and can still be seen through all the people who came to know the Lord through her faithfulness. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you enjoyed, and I can't wait to hear each of your presentations.